Welcome to our 5th episode of Inside Illustration. This episode is part of the Illustration for Publishing season of Inside Illustration, a biannual suite of content created by the Association of Illustrators. And for this season, we're focusing on covers for books aimed at adult readers. We are a UK-based organisation with members from around the world, supporting illustrators across all areas of their professional lives, including contract reviews and advice on licensing, as well as staging events, campaigning for illustrators' rights, and running the annual World Illustration Awards. Covers for both fiction and non-fiction books draw in readers, telling us what the book is about, sometimes in straightforward terms, using decorative techniques, or with imagery more suggestive of atmosphere, each acting as an invitation to purchase and read that particular book. In this session, we're talking to two creatives who are important participants in the book cover world, acting as art director and designers, and also involved with the illustration side. A reminder to AOI members that you have exclusive access to the full range of content for Inside Illustration at theaoi.com/inside-illustration, where we have in-depth articles, a range of resources, and the opportunity for members to take part in an exclusive creative course on book cover illustration. I'm your host, Rachel Emily Taylor, artist, writer and course leader of BA Illustration at Camberwell College of Art. And I'm delighted to welcome our two guests, illustrator and freelance designer Michaela Alcano and creative director of Headline Publishing, Patrick Insole. Michaela, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Michaela Alcano. I am a freelance book cover designer and illustrator. I have worked both in-house in HarperCollins and Penguin Random House, but I've been freelancing for the last 4 years, and I love what I do.
Patrick?
Yeah, I'm Patrick Insole. I am the creative director at Headline Publishing Group. I've been doing that for about 14 years now, so it's been quite a long time in-house there. But prior to that, I was working at Walker Books, working on their children's list. But prior to that, I trained as an illustrator, so my background is in illustration, which I think lends itself very well to designing books and book covers. So it was a very natural segue into the career that I've chosen. And like Mick says, I enjoy it and love it with a passion.
Best job ever.
It is.
So you've both got so much experience in this area. So I thought, let's start talking about cover artwork in sort of general terms. So to both of you, what do you feel is the benefit to having an illustrated cover for a book?
Oh.
I'd say as an art director, you can go first.
I think, well, it's a really interesting question, that, because I think as an art director and designers in publishing generally, we tend not to draw a distinction particularly between illustrative or other ways of creating a cover. To my mind, they're all ways of illustrating. So even the cleanest, purest typographic cover is sort of illustrative and using type as illustration. And similarly, a lot of the covers and a lot of the commercial genres that we publish in, the go-to is photographic paired with type. We sort of feel like you're treating photography as illustration. So for us, it's all about where you're sourcing your visual material for the cover. But we kind of approach it the same way, regardless of whether it's illustrative or typographic, I think.
That's really interesting. It's that idea that lots of different forms like type and photographs can also illustrate or be illustrative of an idea. Michaela, do you have any thoughts?
Exactly what Patrick said. I think depending on the genre you're designing for, the market that you want to hit, it all depends on kind of what you want. The one thing I would say about an illustrative cover is that you are creating something that otherwise you wouldn't be able to find elsewhere. And I think it creates something that's slightly more unique. It creates something that is special for the book itself. And I think being able to source the right illustrator for the right book is always a plus for the book cover.
Yeah, and I'd follow up with that point, actually, is that as an art director or designer, if you're specifically commissioning an illustrator, it is because you want to get that particular audience and get a particular mood across that you can't get through using photography. I mean, there are certain genres where you will always only ever use photography and it's a go-to style and, you know, it gets across to the audience exactly what they're getting. But there are a lot of occasions where you need something a little bit different to signify that the book is a little bit different. And that's what you're looking for in the illustrator, that you're finding an illustrator whose work really sort of speaks to the content in a way that photography or just type cannot do.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So thinking about what, illustration can do that maybe other disciplines can't, what have you enjoyed the most about designing and illustrating book covers?
It's hard in terms of, because I'm a book cover designer and illustrator, so the way I approach briefs is with the two combined. And I've always loved drawing. I grew up drawing since before I can remember. And being able to kind of match story with a style of illustration, I think for me personally, I always try and go out there and learn different styles in order to be able to suit my skill set for different genres and for different books. And I think it's a beautiful thing to be able to do both and to be able to see a brief through both lenses. But I think as well, when I art direct with an illustrator, I think it's a great relationship to build with other illustrators and to see them bring your vision to life.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I mean, it's something that I think about a lot, is book packaging and book design is quite different from other illustrative disciplines in that it does allow you quite often to have that freedom to be slightly more multidisciplinarian. So, you're not just dealing with a picture on the front cover and then somebody else is putting the type on and somebody else sort of doing the other elements. It can be, if you've got the right illustrator involved, they can do everything. They can do the whole thing. And actually, as an art director, that's a gift. If I can find an illustrator that's able to do the whole thing and sort of make sure that the whole thing is sort of done in the same style and sort of there's a real continuity, that's the dream. That's what we really like to work with.
That's really interesting. So it's like looking for an illustrator that has all of the, the skill set to do the whole cover.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think also, even if illustrators don't have book covers in their portfolio per se, I think being able to illustrate with keeping in mind titles and author names and text needing to be on the cover, to be able to illustrate in a way that allows room for text and allows room for the title, which is always equally as important as the imagery. I think illustrators will have a better approach to showing off their portfolio if they can keep that in mind.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that, again, it's the relationship between the art director or the designer and the illustrator, is making sure that, they are communicating really, really well with each other, because what you want is for the type to really work with that illustration. If you've got that relationship working really, really well, you can produce some really beautiful results, even if the illustrator themselves isn't actually sort of handling the type or anything like that.
That was kind of leading on to the next question that I wanted to talk about, which was about typography and about how you approach it. Michaela, maybe we could start with you first about how do you approach typography for a cover?
Yeah, I think going back to being a cover designer and illustrator, my step number one after I've read a manuscript and read what the brief is asking is just putting the type on a blank canvas, because it will then give you an idea how much space you have to work with for the imagery. So say I know I bring this title up a lot, but it's such a long title. I worked on a title which was called Hannah Green and Her Unfeasibly Mundane Existence, which is an incredibly long title. You had to put the author name in there, you had to put a shout line on there. So I think putting the title and the author name on just a blank canvas, it gives you an idea of what space you can work with for the illustration. One thing that you can do is a beautiful illustration, but if you can't pair that up with the space for the text, what ends up happening, and I've seen this on a few covers in the past, that someone's just plonked a title on top of a beautiful illustration with no care involved in trying to match the two, because what a beautiful cover does is that it matches both harmoniously. And I think that's what creates a stunning and captivating cover, is being able to pair those two well and with thought.
That's really interesting, to kind of giving each its own space and they kind of marry and work together. Patrick, do you have any thoughts on that, about the approach to type?
Yeah, well, I think it's crucial. I mean, I work in a very similar way. The type comes first, and actually, if you've got a really long title, I actually really love a really long title.
It's finding the right font as well for that.
Yeah, and actually, most of the time when I'm working with type on a cover, I'm treating it as if it's illustration. You know, I'm working in the same way that I used to when I was doing pure illustration, and you make a virtue of the type. But it's really, really important that you are working with the visual element, whatever that might be, whether if it's photographic or illustrative, that the two are really working in harmony with each other. And that's kind of our job. You know, that's really what the focus of our job is, to make sure that they're not fighting each other, so that when the final cover goes out into the world, you're presenting a really clear vision for the book.
I think also that when I'm working as an art director, I tend to put on the type to show kind of what my idea is. And sometimes I sketch something out really terribly just for the illustrator to know what the vision I have for this cover. But when also some people are hiring me just purely for the illustration, they've done the same in terms of they put on the title and kind of show a really rough scribble of what they want, so that you can understand what their vision is and where the text placement could be with your illustration. And I think that's always a really great thing when someone's art directing an illustrator purely for illustration, to be able to just give them a little bit of a vision of what you want as the art director. I think that's really helpful for illustrators as well.
That's really interesting. I'm kind of curious to know how you approach that, seeing as that you're approaching it from both sides, as an art director and as an illustrator. If somebody's giving you that template to work with at the outset, are you ever tempted to kind of completely redesign it for them?
Yeah, I do wildcards all the time. I think see, it's kind of the same thing in terms of, I'm not a baker, but I love cooking. Baking, you have to follow the recipe like to point, otherwise it will fail. While cooking, you can kind of be like, add a spice here, add a spice there. So I think for me, when someone's hiring me just purely for the illustration, I take on board exactly what they want, and then I tend to provide a couple more examples just in case, just put a spanner in the works and see what happens, really. Yeah.
In case they haven't thought of something that you can bring to the table.
I think that's a really important part of the process. I mean, that's something that, because as a designer and art director, at the outset of a project, even if you've got a really, really clear vision for actually what you want, you know exactly the composition and you've worked out exactly what it should look like, I actually kind of want to be surprised. It's not great when you're commissioning a piece of artwork and what comes back in is exactly what you've asked for.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That can work sometimes. But actually 9 times out of 10, I would say it's the ones where it's like, I didn't think about doing it that way. And you kind of want that bit of surprise, and it gives it a little bit of a boost and it takes it in a slightly different direction. And that's the exciting part for me. If they just do what you've asked, it can be a little bit disappointing.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful for our listeners to hear that.
Yeah. I think it's always important. I mean, not to do loads of different visuals. I know Patrick knows that I do loads of visuals because I get obsessed with the project and I try and, provide as much as where my brain takes me. But even providing 2 to 3 different concepts of what you've been asked for is really helpful for an art director to be able to kind of visualize where they can take the cover. And I think that's where sketches really come in handy, because I think, truthfully, in the past, I used to take all my concepts to final illustration, and 1, I just ran out of time all the time. But 2, if there's constant tweaks, which some covers do, having sketches helps you save on that time. So providing at least 2 to 3 sketches, black and white sketches of where you want to take it, can really help an art director steer their vision for the book.
I guess that kind of leads me into, there's lots of different relationships going on here, relationship between the illustration, the text, the art director and the illustrator, maybe the designer. So I was thinking about that relationship, and I wondered, Patrick, if you could say a little bit more about that relationship between the art director and the illustrator they've commissioned, what that working process might be like.
Well, I mean, every single book and every single process is completely different. And one of the joys of it. It's like, that's why we do it year after year, because it's never the same twice. But as a general rule of thumb, when we're given the brief at the outset of the project, depending on the project, it can be quite prescriptive or it can be quite sort of open-ended, but we'll go away and read the manuscript, maybe get to grips with actually what's wanted and create mood boards of the sort of styles we're after. So we're thinking that we definitely want to go down an illustrative route. We'll find a range of different artists that we think could fit into that mould. And then we'll usually share those mood boards with usually the author and also various people in-house. It's a tricky balance, because often you're showing things which don't look anything like a book cover. And it can be quite dangerous. If you as the art director or designer kind of can see the potential for an illustrator's work for a particular cover, that doesn't necessarily translate on a sort of an example of their work already. So you're having to sort of sell their work to everybody else in the publishing house. Once you've been given the green light to sort of approach them, then you start that dialogue with the artist, and you're sort of throwing ideas at them, they're throwing ideas back. And what you hope and what gets the best results is that there is a constant through flow of kind of ideas back and forth, and you're not sort of giving them a really rigid template to work within, giving them enough space to sort of go away and create their own ideas. And as I said before, that's the thing that I really, really sort of cherish, is if actually they've taken an idea that usually is just a little sketch that I've had, and it's like, well, I think it could look something like this, but I don't have 100% confidence that I'm right. What can you do with it? And part of the reason you're approaching these illustrators is for their vision and their creativity. So depending on what comes back in, then it's a case of sort of how can you get it into the right sort of shape to present it to the wider company and the various teams that have a vested interest in the book, and get it to the point where actually they can buy into it. Can be a very slow process with lots of different rhythms.
I think I tend to try and encourage illustrators, if I'm art directing, sometimes I send them just an excerpt of the book or maybe a paragraph. We are creating covers for someone's piece of work. Someone has spent hours tirelessly, writing this book. I think it's always important to be able to just even grasp a little the essence of what the story is telling. And I think, I hired Kirby Rosanis for Empire of the Vampire that I did with Jay Kristoff. And what I did was, after I sent him a whole mood board and brief, I sent him 2 pages of the book to be like, this is just so you can get a feel of the story. And I think, sometimes it's really important to just even understand, even if it's not the illustrator, you as a designer, to understand what the book's essence is. I think it's really important to be able to get the right cover that's authentic to the story itself.
I think that's really interesting, thinking about this essence, kind of capturing that and like the voice of the author through the extract.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain genres where that is really, really important. I mean, there's some of the more commercial genres.
Less so, yeah.
You can be fairly formulaic about it, rightly or wrongly, and you know what you want from the illustration, and you don't necessarily have to get them to read the thing. You can give them fairly clear, prescriptive ideas about what you want on the cover, but particularly at the more literary end of the spectrum, quite often those are the briefs which are really blank canvas. It's like, I don't know, it could be anything on these covers. All you've got to work with is the title and sort of a vague idea of what the content is. And so for those, actually, it's quite critical that you're not only am I as art director reading the thing, but also whoever else is involved in the creation of the cover is at least reading a little bit of it, or really getting to grips with it, and allowing them the time to really sort of get used to it and sort of live with it for a bit before they start coming up with ideas. Because that, at the end of the day, it's those covers, the more literary end, where the illustration actually plays such a crucial part in how that cover is going to be perceived by the public.
100%.
This kind of thinking as well about this essence also is thinking about style. I know styles come up quite a bit. So I was thinking about when you're looking for illustrators and you're seeking a particular style, maybe from someone you haven't commissioned yet, would you be able to talk a little bit more about that? Do you have an idea of style often when you're working with a cover?
I think as illustrators that want to be illustrators and not book cover designers as well, it's really important to have so what I tell people is that if you want to be a book cover designer and illustrator, you need to be as fluid with your style as possible. But if you want to be an illustrator, you need to really hone in on your style, because you get hired for that style. And I think, it is really important, if you are only an illustrator, to create a style that works for you and that will draw people in. And I think that's where an art director will pick you out for that style itself. Yeah. I don't know, Patrick.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think, that's why I don't illustrate, is because I couldn't find my own style. I was so much more interested in doing different things for every project I worked on. And I really love that variety. But I couldn't make that work as an illustrator, because as an art director, I am looking for that consistency. So when I'm looking at illustrators' portfolios for particular projects, I want to know that they're going to be able to deliver the amazing things that they've got in their portfolio consistently, whatever I ask them to do. So there is that real importance that their style really comes through their work. And there can be quite a lot of flex in that. There can be quite a bit of variety to their work. But that's what you're hiring them for, really.
I mean, Patrick, as you cover a range of imprints at Headline with different focuses, again, thinking about style, are you looking for specific illustration styles for each imprint?
For different genres, definitely. I mean, at the moment, there's a real trend for a sort of very commercial romance fiction, which has a very clear look. A lot of it is slightly influenced by the States. So a lot of the packaging they do is almost sort of manga-esque and a little bit of an anime feel to it. And so, you're looking for artists that can really draw people in a particular way, in a really confident and really clear, very slick way. The more reading group or literary end of the spectrum, actually it's a little bit more varied. I mean, it's completely varied. I mean, you're choosing the style specifically for that book, and there's no real consistency between titles for that readership. It's whatever will suit that particular book. Each book you're treating as an individual, and so each one you're starting afresh, looking at completely new artists, completely different. The broader your sort of reach of finding different artists, the better, because you kind of you don't know who's going to be right for a particular project. You'll find somebody's work in amongst a whole load and think, they'll be just right for this particular book that I'm working on. And you can't necessarily put your finger on why. You just know that stylistically they're a really nice match, but it's different, as I say, totally different from book to book.
So I guess you're looking at them, their portfolio and their work, seeing if they'd be the right match. Would you work with illustrators who don't have previous cover experience?
Yep.
You would do?
Yeah, I've done recently, yeah.
I think sometimes they're the ones that come with the freshest ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they can need a little bit of hand-holding. I mean, the technical side of things can be a challenge. We're sort of really having to guide them actually what the demands of creating artwork for print or, for the specifics of actually making a book jacket are. Really boring stuff like, adding bleed to covers and, making sure...
knowing which colours are not going to print
that sort of stuff,
as well.
And all of that kind of really dull stuff. But that's, we can geek out about that, and that's fine. As long as they've got the bones to their work, which really works for that cover, then it's great. I mean, we just finished some work for some Neil Gaiman reissues. We hired this amazing illustrator from New York called Monet Elisa. I don't think she'd ever done any book jackets at all. It was kind of a completely new thing for her. She'd done loads of really amazing editorial work, but never done anything for books. And it was a joy because, again, it was that thing of being surprised. We kind of briefed her with a bit sort of a vague idea of what we wanted, but actually what she delivered, it wasn't what we were expecting at all. And it just, blew us away. And it's like, that's what you want, particularly for a book like that where it's a sort of special edition. It's a celebration of that particular book because it was, it'd been published a long time ago and we just wanted to bring it to a new audience. And it was just, those sorts of projects where they're books that have been around for a long time. So how do you bring it to a new audience? How can you make it feel fresh? And that's the way. Find an artist who is just going to completely surprise you. And it's brilliant. I love that.
In these kind of, the early stages of development, does the marketing team get involved or...
Nah.
No.
No. Well, I mean...
Gosh, I think the less voices at the beginning, the better it is.
Yeah. I mean, marketing are fun. I mean, I don't know how it works in other publishing houses.
Yeah.
And you probably have a sort of a better idea than I do. But
I think they get involved in cover meetings, but not in terms of ideation.
In my experience, they're usually waiting for you to present to them the finished thing or at least the direction, and then they'll take that and build their marketing campaign from it. Well, it's not in their interest to really drive that vision in the outset. They want the more important relationship actually for us is between the design team and the editorial team. So the editor has acquired the book, it's their vision, and we're driving the sort of the creative vision to package it. And working with them really, really closely. And most of the time working really, really closely with the author as well. And once we're sort of really happy and we feel like the vision for the packaging matches the vision for the book, then we'll present it to the wider publishing teams and sales teams and marketing teams and get their buy-in. And most of the time the marketing team just take it and run. Yeah.
I think, it's great to see when marketing get really excited about a cover because they really get that involved in their promotional materials. But I think as Patrick said, editorial is one of the biggest collaborators and the author for the beginning stages, I guess.
Michaela, when you're being briefed as an illustrator, In thinking about these different approaches between working with art directors, do you find it's quite different depending on who you're working with? Do they have like a different way of, here's a manuscript to read, or here's something we'd like to show? Is it different working with each person?
Yeah, I think, the great thing about freelancing is that instead of just learning from one art director or senior designer or collaborating with them, I get to collaborate with multiple people and I get to learn from them as well, little steps of the way. So yes, everyone has their own way of working. I guess the good thing about publishing is that we do have a very particular way of doing things, and I guess growing up in-house in my career, I've learnt those ways, so I think that kind of helps. But I think for me personally, I always ask for the things that really help me at the beginning and the initial stages. So if something I feel like is, a brief is not comprehensive enough, or if I have more questions, I tend to ask those questions myself. But yeah, I think everyone has their own way of doing things, and I think that's a beautiful way of collaborating with people.
Just to follow up on that, I think it is really important for illustrators to make sure they are asking for anything that they're not necessarily, because they're not necessarily given. As an art director, I try to give the artist what I think they're going to need, but it's important that they feel they've got everything they need to really launch into it. And some artists won't need anything; they literally just need the skeleton of a brief, and that's enough. Others will want to read the whole thing cover to cover.
Me.
Yeah, which is, but that's great. From my point of view, that's really great, because it means I know that they're really invested in it. It's not always necessary, but it's really important that the artist is asking those questions and making sure they're getting what they want, because it's not necessarily a given that they're going to get it from the outset.
So there's no such thing as silly questions.
No, exactly.
I think, if you're invested in getting the right cover and doing your best work, ask as many questions. Every art director I've met have answered all my questions without any hesitation. So.
And Michaela, how do you feel you've developed as an illustrator from your early book cover commissions, learning to ask those questions and that kind of thing?
Oh gosh. You know what? I've run out of bookshelves, which is, a good problem to have, I guess. But I found my first ever cover I did for fantasy. And if you see some of my work, I do love fantasy a lot. And it was just interesting to see kind of where I've developed from my first ever fantasy cover to the ones that I do today. And I think, it all comes with experience. Time helps, and learning from people, learning in-house, learning as a freelancer, learning with collaborating with people always helps develop my style. And I always, at the end of the year, look back at what I've done for that year. And I'm always proud to see where I've pushed my boundaries. And I think also personally, when I get given briefs that are very different, that really helps push me as an artist to find ways of problem solving in areas that I don't necessarily have experience with. So for example, I did my first ever middle grade cover, which I had never done before. And I did a few for Chicken House books, and they were very kind to allow me to try new areas of design and illustration that I had never done before. And I think that's, for me, it gets me really excited. But it means I have to do a lot more research to find what is selling, where are the great illustrations coming from and stuff like that, to really kind of develop my style.
And for that research, would that just be looking online, or how would you find out those kind of...
So every project I do, and I might just be a little obsessive with my job, is after I read the manuscript, I tend to spend a whole day, if not 2 days, researching. So if it's a historical fiction, I research the era, I research what they wore, what kind of jewelry they wore, what's happening during that time. I think because all of those helps me give a more accurate approach to the cover. If it's fantasy or if it's Greek mythology, I went to the British Museum when I did Ariadne for headline. I spent a whole day at the British Museum just walking around and looking at artifacts, because I think doing research that is not just what are the other book covers out there for that genre will really help me kind of find ways to approach that genre, especially if it's commercial fiction, in a very different way, and provide something that's a lot more unique to something that might be a very saturated area. So I truly believe that research before you even start designing will really help give you concepts and ideation once you start actually designing.
I guess it's that we were talking about the essence, so kind of
Yeah.
capturing the essence of the book. I mean, Patrick, I don't know if you see that side of things when you're working as an art director of what the illustrator's doing for research. Do they present any of that to you?
Occasionally. I mean, they're probably scared of frightening us. But I do like to see that. I mean, I think it's really important. I mean, a lot of time, that research will really come through.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really clear in the work that they're presenting if they've done their research. And I think, that's usually enough. But I do like to know that they've kind of put in the legwork and actually explored the genre, explored the ideas, explored all the different references. The flip side to that is you don't want all of that on the cover.
No.
So much of the process of it is distilling that down to something that's really simple and really clear. But I think without the research, you don't get anything like as good a result, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think especially like, what you were saying for literary, there's a lot more of a blank canvas that you can work with less research, I guess, because literary books have such a range of stories. But with commercial fiction, whether it be historical fantasy, historical fiction, fantasy itself, or non-fiction, understanding kind of what the topic the book is talking about will really help. Everyone works in different ways, but I find research such an important part of my job before I even begin projects. And I think it really helps me start getting ideas, because there's been some books I read the manuscript and I've got nothing. I have no idea. So it's just like, I think it's nice because then after I've done research for one particular book, I would possibly get a brief that kind of dips its toes into what I've already done for another book, and then I already have that at hand. And this is where Pinterest is fantastic. Like, I've got endless Pinterest boards for all the projects that I work on, and sometimes if there's a slight overlap, I tend to go back to the boards of other projects to help with ideas. Yeah.
And thinking as well about, building these ideas, but also your portfolio. I think that's something our listeners would be really interested in. But when you're putting together your portfolio, do you consider like having different cover samples, or what would you think would be useful in there? I mean, keeping consistency of style.
I think that all goes back to whether you want to be a cover designer and illustrator or just an illustrator. I think whether you have a unique style that's very true to you, showing diversity on projects really helps in portfolios. But as a book cover designer and illustrator, being able to diversify and showing that you can do multiple genres can really help. I don't know, Patrick, in terms of when you're hiring someone.
Yeah, no, totally. But I think it is that, it's a tricky thing, because I think so much depends on what the personal drive of that illustrator is, because book cover design, as I said at the beginning, it is different from other disciplines in that it's so much more fluid. Illustrators can become designers, can become illustrators again. There's a lot of people that are working across all sorts of different styles. It's trying to find your place, whether you just want to be an illustrator who gets hired to do illustration. That's one thing. And if that's the case, having a really consistent style that people will recognize and go to again and again is kind of what's wanted. But if actually you want to diversify and dip your toe into being a designer or try lots of different things, then actually you kind of need as broad a portfolio as possible. And if you want to do that, I really think actually working in-house for a bit is a really great
100%.
way of learning how to do it. I mean, and not most of the designers, but a lot of the designers that I have in my team or have hired in my team over the years have come from an illustrative background. It goes hand in hand with the design process of designing a book jacket. So it's very fluid. And I think it does totally depend on where you see yourself as a creator.
And I think jumping on the back of that, looking at established artists or designers' works and their portfolios and seeing kind of what they have in their portfolios can really help you give an idea where you want to take your portfolio. So say if you want to be a book cover designer, looking at your favorite book cover designers and looking what their portfolio holds can be really important. But going back to what Patrick said, if you do want to become a cover designer and illustrator, starting in-house is one of the most valuable things that you can do, because you're not just learning the process, you're learning terminology, you're learning kind of the technical side of things, bleed, CMYK, printing, everything like that. And those are a lot of things that if you go straight into freelancing won't teach you. And I think if you do want to eventually freelance, doing a few years in-house to learn those things, to make those connections, to grow under someone that has that experience can really help develop you as a designer and illustrator.
I'm thinking about portfolios, and is it helpful if you've worked on a series to have the whole series in there? It might show that you can have consistency, or you're thinking about trends.
Whether it's genres or series, I think it's really important to show that you can be consistent with the work that you do. That's really powerful in a portfolio itself.
There's also Jennifer Saint covers that you've done, and they kind of show a series and your work there. I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, I think if you're being hired for a particular author, whether her books or their books are a series or just consistent style, it helps show that you can be consistent yet fresh with your ideas. I think with Jenny Saint, I think I always try and push the boundaries for her covers whilst trying to stay consistent with the brand that I created from her first book. And I think if you're an illustrator or a designer that doesn't have that, I tend to encourage people that are just starting out to find a series that they love and then redesign or re-illustrate it so that you can show in your portfolio that you can be consistent with a series style or an author style.
Patrick, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think having a consistent series style is really important, but your point about how you always push, for each new book in the Jenny Saint series, you're always trying to push it a bit more. That is really important as well, because so it can develop, over a series, that style or the cover can change quite a bit. And, we're looking for that as publishers as well. Each book, the brief that comes around for a series as successful as Jenny's, yes, we want the same, but more. We want the same, but different. And it's, actually finding a way to sort of develop it and make it bigger and better than it's ever been. That's the challenge, because what you don't want is just the same old each time. So yes, it's important to have kind of a series that's consistent and you come back for the same thing each time, but it's also got to grow as well. And that's got to come through in the portfolio. You've got to be able to see that the illustrator can sort of develop their style over a series rather than just keep doing the same thing on rote.
I think on that note as well, the danger is that when you get hired for something and something is successful, I mean, I can't tell you how many Greek mythology briefs I got after Jenny Saint.
Yes.
And I took a couple on. I've got a wonderful author, Sarah Underwood, for the YA space that I loved. But personally, I try and say no to Greek mythology briefs because I have my favorite authors that I've already been doing work for, and I know personally if I say yes to all of them, I'm not going to be able to create fresh ideas for when Jenny has a new book coming out or when Sarah has a new book coming out. And for me, I want to be as true to my current authors as much as possible. And I think with Greek mythology, there's a limit to be able to mold your design to multiple different authors. And I always want to put as much effort and love and care into my current authors in that space as much as possible.
I guess your work becomes connected to Jenny's writing, so that's what people will see your work and maybe recognise.
It's great to be able to push my style in the same space to do something very different, which I did with Sarah Underwood, but there is always a limit, and I think knowing where your limit is so that you can provide those fresh ideas for what you currently already have is really important as well.
Thinking about to both of you, do you get a sense that the UK book covers really stand out in the global publishing landscape?
Great question.
Wow. I was once, not to blow my own trumpet, I was once asked on Simon Mayo's Drive Time radio show why US covers are so bad. And I had to give some answer about that, and it was very difficult. It's difficult. I do think they do. But I also think that not individual country as such, but every sort of publishing area has their own trends, different way of approaching things. So what works in the UK, we're very proud of. I think we feel we've got a very creative, very buzzy, particularly at the minute. It feels like, packaging for publishing is going through a really, really golden period, I think. I mean,
100%.
I don't know
With
if
special
that's-
editions as well.
Yeah,
like
it's really exploded in a way that we hadn't necessarily foreseen. And that's great for the UK, but actually in other markets overseas, it's quite, they have different ways of doing things and different approaches. There are genres here which we wouldn't even consider using illustration for, but in France, they would. So crime, for example, they're very keen on using almost like fine art on some of their crime packaging, which we just look at and think there's no way you're going to sell any copies here. It does depend a little bit on genre, but I think there are certain areas where we play it safe and certain areas where we really push it. And the same is true of the US. There are certain areas in the US where I look at, and this is the answer I gave on the radio thing, was a lot of their stuff looks to us, to our eye, quite dated. But having said that, there are whole tranches of their literary area which they're producing the most beautiful
Amazing
covers,
stuff,
really incredible stuff that you look at and think, wow, that's, it's just amazing. And some of that translates over to here. We'll take their designs for our editions over here and it works really well, but it doesn't always translate. So it's a really tricky, but really sort of changeable landscape, I think.
I think it's really interesting working with both the US and the UK market and Europe to see kind of what they want from a cover. And actually there's been a few times where I've been hired for the same book, both the US and the UK, where I have to produce two very different covers. But more and more I've realized that the US and a lot of my covers are being bought for both the US and the UK's editions. I agree with what Patrick says with the kind of literary space. They're producing such cool covers. And whenever I get the opportunity to go, I tend to spend ages mainly in the literary section because what they've produced in kind of that area, which I think in particular the UK tends to play it safe in those areas a lot more. The US get to be a bit more experimental, I guess, in that area. But it's interesting because I had to very quickly as a freelancer learn both spaces and both markets and what they're trying to aim for. But with everything, the trends change so quickly over the years, and you have to be on top of seeing what's selling to make sure that you know what's going to be fresh for the next coming year. I think if you're not doing your market research, it's going to really bite you in the bum later. Yeah.
So thinking about that, you're working with US publishers as well. Would you encourage illustrators to get their work in front of overseas publishers?
100%. I think no market is off limits. I think it'll grow you as an illustrator. Also, the Americans pay a lot better.
They do.
Gonna be really completely honest. But, I think there's conversations that are being had here versus the US. I'm always a bit scared that the US are going to steal a lot of great designers from the UK because of that. Hopefully not. But I think, again, Europe have some really cool... I'm working with a couple of publishers in Spain, in France, in Italy, and they really love to push the boundaries. And for me, that's really exciting because it means I get to do work that's not necessarily what I already have in my portfolio. And I really value that, and I really learn from that as well.
Spread your net as wide as you can. It is such a global thing. And I think we're seeing so many of our packaging that we do in the UK is being sold as part, when we're selling the rights to our books to foreign territories, the cover will go with it quite often, so that they're as interested in our packaging as the book itself. And that's really important for illustrators to remember, is their work. Even though it's just gracing the cover of a book in the UK, it can work equally well in other territories. It might work in different ways, and they might have to adapt slightly. But there is an appetite. It can open up all sorts of different avenues. I can't really speak for the children's market particularly, but the children's market is, I feel, even more so. It kind of feels like there's a really global reach for people's work.
I think also, put my illustrator hat on, if you're working with lots of different markets, going back to what Patrick says, you never know, your art might be sold on eventually because it will be put in front of different eyes on different markets to be sold on. And again, that can give you potentially a sell-on fee as an illustrator as well. So, I did the Game of Thrones for Italy, and that eventually got sold on to Spain's editions for Game of Thrones. So, I never say no to smaller markets, because I think that they give you such opportunities. And again, if you're working with the US, it might give you back an opportunity in the UK for having your work presented in the UK market. Same with France, Italy, Spain. Never limit yourself to one territory, because I think that will do you a disservice of where your work can be seen.
And also thinking about the difference between hardback and paperback. Do you generally commission different covers for hardback and paperback, or?
These days, if the hardback does well, it will take on a fresher look for the paperback.
Yeah, quite often the conversation in cover meetings is, we just need to paperbackize it.
Yeah.
And what that means is just jazzing it up ever so slightly, or just, and you are just ringing the changes.
Yeah. Minimizing filigree down to something that's a bit more punchier for the paperback.
Yeah, because it's got to work at a slightly smaller size for a start. So, and quite often by the time it gets to paperback, you are wanting to put on a lot of endorsements. So if it's a particularly successful hardback, when it was in hardback, you tend not to have many quotes because nobody's had a chance to read it yet. When it comes to the paperback, you want to cram loads of great quotes on the front saying how amazing the book is. And so then the artwork has to sort of somehow work with all these extra words on the cover that weren't there before. And so it's a case of simplifying it down and cleaning it up a little bit and refreshing it. But most of the time we try to create a vision for the hardback which will then work through, because you want that continuity for your marketing campaign and the publicity to go through. That said, there are occasions where from the outset that they're two different markets. There are some where, and actually I'd say probably more at the literary end, the hardback will be the thing of real beauty, where it tends to be more illustrative and is a little bit more arty. And then for the paperback, you want to kind of reach a slightly more commercial audience sometimes.
Okay,
I mean, not always. And then quite often you'll be like, well, actually, we need to go photographic. And it's slightly heartbreaking, because you have this amazing, beautiful cover that sort of feels like it's only had a short life.
Yeah.
But it's just serving a different purpose and reaching a different audience.
Yeah, and I think also with what's happening in the market at the moment with special editions and exclusive editions and stuff like that, I think being able to create a hardback that is very almost a collectible will help interest buyers for wanting to buy the hardback, because I know a lot, like in the past, people wait usually for the paperback to come out because obviously it's a bit easier to take on holiday and carry around in your bag. But I've seen a massive shift of people wanting to buy hardbacks as almost like a collectible art to buying books, I guess. So there is that thought in when you're creating something for a hardback, making sure that you're creating something that is almost special, I guess, and then being able to minimize it for the paperback that is a lot more punchier. And I think with the special edition market, it's proving that people want to buy hardbacks these days, as long as it's special to them, and also having exclusives for indie bookshops so that, people aren't just buying on the bigger chains, can create something very special.
I'm sure our listeners would like to know this as well, but does the illustrator get a copy of the book after?
Look, I'm going to say Patrick and Headline are fantastic at that when I bug them. But please to all the illustrators, just bug them for a copy. I have in instances been really disappointed because I've been promised a special edition that I've created, and then I don't get that in the end, which is slightly disappointing. So I tend to buy a lot of my books, and then if I get a copy, I get an extra thing. I'm being brutally honest. People do better. For me, I've been so disappointed in so many instances in the past that I tend to just buy my own versions, and then tax deductible, I guess. But then if I do get an extra copy, that's a bonus, and I would say my sixth love language is giving books to people. So it's always nice to be able to just give someone a book if I do have an extra copy.
Yeah, it's worth asking, and not to sort of defend publishers too much.
It's great when you work in-house, because you can go and walk over to production and be like, can I get a copy?
It's changed. That's changed though. I mean,
really?
we're getting fewer advances coming in. And it's just a sustainability thing. So,
do you think that's also due to COVID as well?
Maybe. There's certainly fewer books coming into the office than there used to be. It's funny. When I used to work at Walker Books, in the basement we had a room called The Shed, where you could just go and help yourself to copies of
I
pretty
love
much everything.
those places.
It was amazing.
We used to have a bin at HarperCollins and a room in Transworld. It was
and
great.
you could just get lost down there and find, find all these real hidden gems that you hadn't seen for years. That doesn't exist anymore. All the books go into warehouses in somewhere near Oxford. If you want a copy of the book, you do have to ask for it, and we have to ask for them. So it's not a given that we get them. But that said, if you've worked on a book, you should feel you should ask. You should be able to ask, and one will be sent to you. Because it's not, it's a bit of emailing, it's a little bit of ordering from our point of view, but it's easily done, and they deserve it, to be honest.
I was thinking, to wrap up, if you can think of 3 takeaways for our listeners. So, maybe 3 things. It could even be summarising some of the conversations we've already had, but things that you might think would be useful for illustrators to know when they're working on book covers. I mean, almost I would say, from just listening to our conversation, it's thinking about asking questions, not being afraid to ask questions, and presenting something, that you haven't necessarily been asked for, so like a surprise. So they're things that really stand out to me. But if you've got any other tips.
Gosh, okay. I'm going to struggle with 3. So I'll start with my first one, which I love to be open and honest about this with everyone that's starting out in this area. Read your contracts. I think it's one of the most important things. If you don't agree with it, or if there are clauses that you don't agree with, ask the question. The worst they can say is no, but I think be firm in knowing your rights as an illustrator. The sad thing I've seen lately is that a lot of publishers have been sneaking in world rights for the same price as what they originally put in for just UK Commonwealth. Again, please don't ever be afraid to ask that question. I think I'm a true believer on, if you are asking that question on your behalf, eventually you're asking that question on the behalf of other illustrators as well. And that can potentially change what is happening in the market at the moment. For me, that is one of the biggest pinnacle things. I hate reading contracts. It's the most boring thing, and sometimes they're so confusing to my illustrator, designer brain, especially with certain big words that I have no understanding of. But I think it's one of the most pinnacle things, and will set you up in the future to be able to have those conversations again with sell-on fees, with buying into different markets. It will all give you a better understanding of the whole issue.
And I guess I might just chip in there to say that AOI members have access to information on contracts there's lots of resources that the AOI has that they can look into for that. I think that's a really good tip.
I think it's really important. I mean, I think, again, speaking on behalf of the publishers, a lot of the time, they're defaults. And those defaults, they don't necessarily work for every illustrator and every project and every book. So, and we, as when we're sending the contracts out, they are really boring. We don't necessarily read them as thoroughly as we should. So it is really important for the person at the other end to get advice and make absolutely sure that, because they're not, by and large, the clauses in the contracts, they're not trying to trip you up. They're not trying to con you out of fee or rights or anything like that, usually. I can't speak for every publisher, but certainly for publishers that I've worked with, they're usually made to be as fair as possible. But having said that, they're not specific. So it's really important that the illustrator is kind of really making sure that they're taking the time to check that it's suiting their needs. And I think it's going back to that thing of asking questions. It's asking the question. It's never a problem to kind of query a clause in a contract. It's like, actually, I'm not entirely sure about this. You're not going to be met by any antagonism on the part of the publisher. Usually they'll want to make it work.
I think, as you said, sometimes they are generic. So I once did a book for a publisher. Book 1, I asked for their price to be UK Commonwealth only, and then they hired me for book 2 and sent me the original contract for world rights, and then I was like, no, but if I didn't read that, I would have signed myself to world rights without realizing that I already fought for book 1 for just UK Commonwealth for the price as well. So I think what I used to do at the beginning of my freelance career and having to read a lot of contracts is write down the clauses that you want to question and keep them somewhere, because then you can parallel check when a new contract from a different publisher comes in, just making sure. And if you have people that have worked in the industry, asking them questions if you don't understand something. I once ended up having to hire a tax person for the day to ask what the tax laws between different countries were, because I didn't understand that. But then now I try and share that with as many people as possible because, I'm a big believer on sharing information. It's the best way forward to really promote artists in this landscape that's ever changing. Never be scared of asking questions.
Thank you. Thank you both.
That's one.
That's one. Yeah, I would say if you don't have a big portfolio, give yourself personal projects. If you're coming straight out of uni, I tell this to all the students that ask me questions or I do talks for, give yourself personal projects, because if you depend on just your uni portfolio, your portfolio is going to look like everyone else's. So finding ways on, okay, I haven't ever covered a crime cover. Maybe I'll just give myself a personal project. I'm just going to read a crime book that's out there and then re-jacket that cover. I think that will really help your portfolio and actually build your skills as well. So learning different programs such as, we heavily use Photoshop and InDesign. I, as an illustrator, use Procreate all the time. So learning new skills on all of those programs will really help kind of showcase your work. And then also kind of keeping up with trends. That's my third one. Mm-hmm. Keeping up with color trends at the end of every year. And yes, I'm, again, very nerdy when it comes to these things. But I tend to spend a whole week looking at color trends, font trends, design trends, and not necessarily just a book cover design for the next coming year and what articles. So creative review, it's nice that Creative Market, all of these resources are really great to kind of talk about trends and see kind of what colors are happening, because if it's happening in fashion, your eye is going to be looking for that color elsewhere. Same with fonts. If it's happening in branding, your eye is going to be wandering around that in Waterstones. So I think following trends is a key part to keeping your designs fresh. And, even things like fonts, because we use fonts obviously on a daily basis. I have a database of fonts saying fantasy fonts or serif fonts or sans serif fonts or quirky fonts or scripty fonts, because then I can always go back to that database and try a different font. Otherwise, I'm going to be using Orpheus Pro on every cover that I use. And I think it's a really great way to be able to kind of push your designs, is finding new fonts that are not necessarily always used on covers. I've done my 3, Patrick.
Yeah, you probably stole mine as well, to be fair. The key one for me is research. I mean, I think, and different kinds of research. There's the research for the actual projects. But for me, critically, if you're trying to get your work seen and liked by art directors and designers in publishing houses, is researching the market. So really getting a sense of how your work fits in to each publishing house is doing. It's no good presenting a portfolio that kind of might be amazing, but if there's no real clear way in to the kind of covers that they are currently publishing, then it's probably not going to result in any commissions. So it's really being sure that you're tailoring your portfolio and making sure that what you're presenting is sort of, it doesn't have to be book covers, but you're tailoring it so you can kind of see, you've given some thoughts to how your work can be used by this particular publishing house. But the second one is about clarity, I think, for book packaging in particular. I mean, it's true, I think, of any illustration, but in book packaging in particular, it's not overcomplicating things. It's keeping things really, really simple and making it absolutely clear that you've just got one idea or one message that you are just getting across as simply and clearly as possible. There are so many books coming out all the time, and each of these book covers, and they always come out with the stats that you've only got like a couple of seconds of people's attention, and your illustration has got to capture that attention instantly, and that clarity is something that's sometimes quite lacking when you see a lot of portfolios. It's kind of, they want to shoehorn everything in there, or they want to sort of really demonstrate their skills by making things as elaborate as possible, and that often doesn't really chime with what we're trying to do. So it's really sort of refinement and clarity is really important.
I think that goes back to doing your research. If you're presenting your portfolio to, say, a particular imprint, obviously, like, for example, Penguin Random House or Hachette, very big companies, and you've managed to get one email from there, making sure that you know what that imprint or that division publishers. So say if it's a primarily literary imprint, then tailoring your portfolio to that really helps. Or if it's something a bit more commercial, making sure that you're tailoring your portfolio in that area. And also going back to emailing, never be scared of cold emailing. I mean, I'm sure Patrick gets emails on a daily basis. I used to get emails when I was working in-house, and we're never fazed by them. So never be scared to just send your work to people, because I think, again, it gets your work out there, and the worst they can do is not reply. But most of the time, people,
they probably won't. But you can bet that it will be saved.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I have folders full of illustrators who have sent their work, and I love that. It's great, because you never know when it's going to come to fruition and lead to a commission. And I think it's really important for people to, the research thing is so important. Working out who you're sending it to, remembering that Hachette, it's not just one art department. It's like 20. And the same with Penguin Random House. There's so many different art directors, all looking for different things. So use the directory, find those names, get your work sent to them if you can.
Instagram plays a really...
Totally,
because so many departments now have Instagrams for their art department.
Yeah.
So if you've got an email for, say, Vintage at Penguin Random House, look at their art department Instagram to see kind of what they're producing. I think... there's a beauty of social media these days. You have access to all of that. You guys have.
Yeah, fledgling. Needs a bit of work.
But it's still there.
It's growing. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think that was more than 3.
Yeah, there you go.
Lots for our listeners at home. And thank you so much for joining us for this discussion.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
For more on what's come up in our conversation today, there is information on terms and conditions and licensing and contracts. AOI members can check our website for resources on all of the topics discussed today, plus access to the pricing calculator tool, which assists in working out fee levels for quotes, including for book publishing commissions. There are also lots of free resources for all illustrators to access. If you haven't heard them already, previous episodes of Inside Illustration are also available, with top guests giving lots of practical information on the illustration world. Thank you for listening.